Hey everyone, welcome to a deep dive. We're going to take a look at the life of Blessed Alejandrina Maria da Costa,
Cool.
a 20th century mystic. We've got
What?
some really interesting biographical details and spiritual reflections here that should help us understand her better.
One of the things that's always fascinated me about Blessed Alejandrina is how she experienced the stigmata.
Yeah,
Most people probably know about the stigmata, but hers were invisible.
invisible stigmata.
Yeah,
That's incredible. It's like a much more hidden, intimate connection to Christ's suffering.
exactly. It wasn't something that was like for public show. It was very personal.
Right.
And in her diary, she actually describes a vision where Jesus tells her that he wants her to enkindle his love in the world.
Oh, wow.
And he draws a parallel to St. Margaret Mary Alacoque.
Wow, that's a powerful mission.
Mm-hmm.
And especially with the invisible stigmata, I'm curious, how was Alejandrina supposed to do this?
Well, this really ties back to the devotion to the Sacred Heart, which St. Margaret Mary Alacoque,
Yeah.
helped to popularize.
Right.
Jesus was basically asking Alejandrina to reawaken this love in a world that desperately needed it.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
He asked her to do this through her suffering.
Wow.
In her diary, Jesus says, "Only with pain will souls remain united to the fibers of your soul," which kind of suggests that her suffering wasn't meaningless.
Yeah.
It was a way to draw others closer to him.
It's a pretty profound concept,
Right.
seeing suffering not as something to avoid, but as a path to deeper spiritual connection.
Yeah, it makes you think.
It really does.
And her life was definitely full of hardship.
Yeah.
I know you wanted to talk about the assault and the paralysis a little bit later,
Right.
but even before that, she had significant challenges in her life.
Yeah, from what I've read about her, it definitely seems like life was not easy for her. But it is remarkable how she responded to all these difficulties with unwavering faith. It's almost like she found a deeper meaning within those challenges.
Definitely. She offered her suffering for the conversion of sinners. She saw it as a way to participate in Christ's redemptive work.
Wow.
And she said that Jesus told her, "If you want to find me, my daughter, seek me in your heart and in your soul." So he was emphasizing that true union with him is found within, even in the midst of suffering.
So instead of kind of getting bitter or resentful, she really embraced it.
Yeah.
To connect with Christ and to help others to do the same. That's a pretty radical way of looking at hardship.
It really is.
Yeah.
It raises some really interesting questions for us.
Yeah.
If she could find such profound meaning in suffering, what does that say about how we approach our own challenges?
That's a great point. And speaking of profound experiences, I was absolutely amazed to learn that Alejandrina lived solely on the Eucharist for 13 years.
Wow.
For anyone listening who might not be familiar with this, can you explain how that's even possible?
Sure. So this is something known as incorruption, and it really shows the extraordinary power of the Eucharist in the Catholic tradition.
Right.
For Alejandrina, doctors confirmed that she didn't consume any food or drink other than the Eucharist for a prolonged period of time.
So for 13 years, the Eucharist was her only sustenance. It's like her physical existence was sustained by her spiritual connection with Christ.
It really shows her deep devotion to the Eucharist and how she saw it as more than just a symbolic ritual. Remember how Jesus told her to seek him in her heart.
Yeah.
The Eucharist for her was the very source of life.
Which makes her words on her deathbed even more powerful.
Mm-hmm.
She said, "Do not sin anymore. The pleasures of this life are worth nothing. Receive communion, pray the rosary every day." That summarizes everything.
Wow.
Even at the end, she was focused on guiding others toward a deeper connection with Christ.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like in those simple yet profound words, she distilled her life's wisdom.
Right.
She was telling everyone to turn away from the fleeting pleasures of the world and embrace the eternal joy found in God.
A message that resonates even today. But there's a lot more to unpack here.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's amazing how Alejandrina's devotion to the Eucharist wasn't just like a personal thing.
Right.
It was really connected to her understanding of suffering
Okay.
and the message of Fatima.
I would love to hear more about that. I know our listeners are probably familiar with the basics of Fatima.
Sure.
But how did she specifically connect her experiences to that?
Well, she was deeply devoted to Our Lady of Fatima.
Okay.
And she really saw her life's mission as an extension of what was revealed there. Remember, Fatima emphasized prayer, especially the Rosary,
Right.
penance for the conversion of sinners, and devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary.
Yeah, and all of those things are so central to her life, too.
Just like
She was living out that message of Fatima.
Exactly. She wasn't just praying the rosary. She was offering up her immense suffering as like an act of penance and intercession for others. And her devotion to the Eucharist was, in a sense, a direct response to the call for deeper love for the sacrament
Okay.
as a source of grace and strength.
It's such a beautiful connection. She really kind of wove all those elements together in her life. I want to circle back, though, to something that we touched on a little bit earlier.
It's okay?
The assault that led to her paralysis.
Right.
This was obviously a pivotal moment in her life.
Sure.
And I'm curious to kind of explore how it shaped her spiritual journey.
Yeah, it was a very traumatic event that really had a lasting impact on her.
Yeah.
She was only 14 years old when it happened.
14. It's hard to even imagine the fear and pain she must have gone through.
I know.
In the sources, it mentions that she jumped from a window to escape her attackers,
Yeah.
which resulted in the paralysis that confined her to bed for most of her life.
Yeah, it's a very tragic story, but it's also really a testament to her resilience.
Right.
You know, instead of being consumed by bitterness or despair, she really turned to her faith
Yeah.
for strength and meaning.
I feel like many people in that situation, might have questioned their faith,
Yeah.
but she seemed to find even greater strength in it. How do you see that reflected in her writings and the accounts of her life?
There's this one quote from her diary where she recounts Jesus telling her, "Suffering, my daughter, is the key that opens heaven's gate."
Wow.
And it seems like she really took those words to heart.
Yeah.
She didn't see her suffering as a punishment,
Okay.
but as an opportunity to grow closer to Christ and share in his redemptive work.
It's such a radical perspective, but it's also incredibly inspiring
Yeah.
to see suffering not as something that should be feared or avoided, but as a potential pathway to something deeper,
Yeah.
more meaningful.
It's a challenging concept,
Yeah.
but it really is at the core of Christian spirituality.
Right.
You know, Christ himself embraced suffering on the cross
Right.
for the salvation of humanity.
Mhm.
And Alejandrina, in her own way, was following in his footsteps.
And her physical limitations didn't limit her spiritual growth.
Right.
It seems like they intensified it.
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
You confined to her bed. She had all this time for prayer, reflection, and those mystical experiences.
Right.
Her room became like a sanctuary,
Yeah.
a place where she could encounter Christ in a profound way.
It's like her suffering became the catalyst for an even deeper spiritual awakening. And it wasn't just a private experience, it impacted those around her.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
People were so drawn to her faith and her message of hope.
Right.
They saw in her an example of how to find meaning and purpose, even in the midst of unimaginable suffering.
Her story challenges our conventional ideas of strength and resilience.
Yeah.
We often think of those things as physical prowess or worldly success. But Alejandrina, she embodied a totally different kind of strength. The strength of the human spirit,
Yeah.
fueled by faith and love.
Very well said.
Yeah.
And that strength really allowed her to embrace her role as a victim soul, which is a really important concept to understand her life and her mission.
I'm glad you brought that up,
Yeah.
because the term victim soul might sound kind of strange to some people listening.
Right.
Can you elaborate on what that means in the context of her life?
Sure. So it refers to someone who willingly offers their suffering in reparation for the sins of others.
Oh, wow.
It's a way of participating in Christ's redemptive work,
Okay.
uniting one's pain with his suffering on the cross for the salvation of souls.
So she didn't just see her suffering as a personal trial, but as like a way to contribute to the spiritual well-being of others,
Right.
which is incredibly selfless.
It really is. And it's important to note that this concept of a victim soul isn't unique to Alejandrina.
Okay.
It's got a long tradition in Catholic spirituality, with figures like St. Therese of Lisieux,
Right.
St. Faustina Kowalska,
Right.
embodying similar ideals.
So she's really part of this kind of larger tapestry
Yeah.
of individuals who have embraced suffering as a way to, draw closer to Christ,
Exactly.
intercede for others.
And her story highlights how suffering, when united with Christ's suffering,
Yeah.
can be a source of incredible grace,
Wow.
not just for the individual, but for the whole world.
It's a profound concept, one that I think we could all benefit from reflecting on. It's not about, romanticizing suffering,
Right.
seeking it out,
Right.
but recognizing its potential power when it's approached with faith and love.
Yeah, well said. And for Alejandrina, that transformative power was very connected to the Eucharist,
Mm-hmm.
her connection to Fatima,
Right.
and ultimately her mission to enkindle love for Jesus in the world.
It's amazing how all of these threads weave together to create such a rich and meaningful tapestry.
Mm-hmm.
It's really given me a whole new perspective on her life and her message.
Yeah, me too. And there's still so much to explore, like her
Right.
mystical experiences.
Yes. Yeah, her mystical experiences. It's amazing to think about how deep her spiritual life was, even confined to her bed. I know, right? The sources mention that she had visions and ecstasies, yeah, often experiencing the Passion of Christ in a very tangible way.
Yeah, you're right. Her mystical experiences were a huge part of her journey.
Okay.
She would actually relive the Passion every Friday,
Mm.
feeling the physical pain of Christ's suffering
Wow.
in her own body.
That's incredibly intense. To actually experience the crucifixion in such a visceral way, it's
Yeah.
almost beyond comprehension,
It is.
but it really does speak to the depth of her devotion
It does.
and her willingness to unite her own suffering with Christ's.
It does. And these experiences weren't just about pain, though.
Right.
She also had visions of angels and saints and even Jesus himself.
Wow.
And these encounters gave her a lot of comfort
Okay.
and guidance and a deeper understanding of God's love.
It sounds like those mystical experiences were a source of strength for her, especially in those times of such intense physical and emotional suffering.
Totally. And it's interesting to note that these experiences often coincided with her invisible stigmata.
Oh, wow.
Remember how we talked about those wounds being a hidden connection to Christ's suffering?
Yeah.
Her mystical experiences were another manifestation of that deep union.
It's like those wounds were a physical representation of the spiritual reality she was living.
Yeah.
It's all the more remarkable when you consider that for the last 13 years of her life, her only sustenance was the Eucharist.
I know.
Doctors confirm that she didn't consume any food or drink
Right.
other than Holy Communion.
You know, imagine living solely on the Eucharist for 13 years.
I can't even imagine.
It just does so much about her faith,
Right.
her understanding of the Eucharist as the true source of life.
It's such a beautiful testament to her belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist.
Yeah.
And it all connects back to everything we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The suffering, her mystical experiences, her devotion to Fatima.
Right.
And ultimately her mission to enkindle that love for Jesus.
Totally. It all fits together to paint this picture of a woman so connected to Christ,
Right, yeah.
willing to embrace suffering and empowered by the Eucharist
Yeah.
to live out this extraordinary calling.
And even on her deathbed, her message remained the same.
I know.
Do not sin anymore, she said. The pleasures of this life are worth nothing. Receive communion, pray the rosary every day.
Yeah.
That summarizes everything.
Powerful words.
Really powerful words to leave behind.
Yeah, it's so simple yet so profound. You know, she wasn't giving some complex theological lesson.
Right.
She was just reminding people of the essentials.
Yeah.
Turn away from sin.
Yeah.
Seek nourishment in the Eucharist.
Mm-hmm.
Embrace a life of prayer.
It's a message that's just as relevant today
Definitely.
as it was back then.
Yeah, in a world that often prioritizes instant gratification and material possessions.
Right.
Alejandrina reminds us that true happiness comes from something much deeper.
Blessed Alejandrina's life was truly remarkable, a testament to the power of faith, the beauty of suffering, and the strength of the human spirit.
I agree. And it leaves us with this powerful question.
Yeah.
If she could find such a connection to Christ and inspire so many people,
Right.
even while suffering,
Yeah.
what's possible for us?
A really beautiful thought to leave our listeners with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life of Blessed Alejandrina. It's been quite a journey.